Hello my quilting friends! Leah Day here with a new video for the Machine Quilting Block Party. Today I'm quilting block number 9, our Pot of Petunias block. And this was a pretty intense block to piece, so let's learn how to quilt it with some simple designs together. So here is our beautiful Pot of Petunias block, and I have already stitched this in the ditch. I got started stitching around the leaf shape and the flower shape, and then down around the vase, and I just work my way around the block that way, and then also stitched in the ditch between the center of the block and the border. I didn't stitch in the ditch along these lines in the vase because my beautiful feather is going to cover over that, and I also didn't stitch in the ditch around the flying geese unit we have because, again, we're going to cover over that with these circles. So that's how I prepped up the block, and I'm going to get started quilting in this center circle. So I've pulled up thread here, and I'm going to carefully stitch on that marked line. I want this to be a nice smooth circle shape, and then I've decided to add a little bit more texture to my block, and this is 100% optional, but you can add it if you like. So I'm going to just fill in that space with a little spiral and then travel stitch my way all the way back out. I think little touches of texture like that really add to the block and really make it look good. It kind of makes it your own. And then I'm going to do a little cheat. I don't feel like breaking thread with each of these circles, so I'm going to escape by stitching in the ditch, and that helped me reach this next marked circle. So I'm just focusing on quilting the circle smoothly and staying right on the marked line. I've got these thread tails here in the center that are going to cause me some problems, but I just try and move them out of the way, and as soon as I'm far enough away from them, I'll be able to hide them in the middle of the quilt. So I decided to fill in this section between the smaller circle and the next circle with some micro stippling. And this is just a very dense version of stippling. So I just shrink down the distance between those lines of quilting so it's on a really small scale. And you will not find this marked on your quilting diagram because this is just too tiny to mark. So what I'm focusing on here is just wiggling around and creating a very random design and fitting it into that space between those two lines of quilting. Get those thread tails out of the way here. Now I'm doing this mostly just to add a little extra accent to that flower design. I just think it'll look better. It emphasizes the circles. It's going to draw more attention to the circular shapes. And it also is going to blend in nicely with the block because we have a larger scale stippling in the background. So this is kind of something you can do just to stitch your quilt up a notch, just to make it just that little bit of extra attention and detail. It's not required, but if you're wanting to make your quilts a little bit better, then this is one of the things that you can do. You can also travel stitch along that inner circle, and this adds an extra layer of thread over this area, kind of like making using bold font whenever you're writing. It just adds extra emphasis, makes those circles stand out a bit better. And now here I'm going to go back to my micro stippling design. I'm going to wiggle out and go on ahead and quilt this outer circle too, kind of just give myself an outline, make sure that I'm not overshooting as I fill in this area with micro stippling. And it doesn't take a lot of time, you know? I mean, I might be stitching for, just a minute through this area, and it just adds that extra punch of texture, really makes it look special. But it's absolutely not required. If you didn't want to add the micro stippling, just stitch straight out. Use that little escape hatch by stitching, through the ditches, and that will allow you to get through and stitch the rest of the circles. So I'm going to stitch around the circle one more time, again, just adding that little extra emphasis, little extra bit of thread. It's kind of funny anytime I receive an email and somebody's like, is travel stitching like legal? I've had people kind of sometimes get marks off on quilt shows for having travel stitching in their quilts. And that's so funny because, that's completely subjective. It's totally up to the judges and kind of their opinion as to what the rules of quilting are. But it's absolutely, in my opinion, allowed and necessary. You have to be able to travel stitch to get to one area of the design or another. And to me, I think it makes it, that much more special and makes the quilt prettier too. So here I'm coming up on the rest of my micro stippling, and I want to interlock this with the first, so I'm going to kind of try and wiggle through here so it doesn't have an obvious, like, here's where you started micro stippling and here's where you finished up micro stippling. You know, I want it to be one fluid texture throughout that space. I'll probably be saying that a lot in this video, trying to make it look as if it's one connected texture, you know, just one nice flow through that whole area, and I think that looks good. So now I'm going to escape out through that ditch. If I stitch carefully in the ditch, then my stitches will hopefully hide, which it didn't hide as well as I'd like, but that's okay. You know, another trick that you can do is I can grab a blue marker that matches that thread color or the fabric color and just color my stitches blue. And then it won't matter that they kind of are standing up a little bit on the surface of the fabric. And you can color it in a little bit and that will hide it as well. So there's lots of little tricks and tips like that, ways of disguising your mistakes or your stitches, and no one will really be able to tell unless they, of course, look on the back of your block. So I'm going to do one little extra bit of micro stippling. I'm going to do that in the background of the flower. Again, it's 100% optional. I just think that this is going to add that little extra punch of texture and really make that flower stand out. It's also going to make that circle design that we added to the flower stand out as well. Now you might be wondering, is this going to make my quilt block stiff? Now certainly in the flowers, you know, this much stitching, they're going to be slightly on the stiffer side, but that does not mean that your whole quilt will be stiff. You know, the whole quilt is being roughly quilted on a 1/2 inch scale. Sometimes we bring the lines a little closer together, sometimes they're further apart, but for the most part it's a 1/2 inch scale, and that's still going to be nice and soft. It is, you know, not going to be as soft as it would be if you just maybe stitched it in the ditch and were done with it, but it's definitely still going to be a nice soft cuddly quilt. And the other thing I always look at is, you know, this is kind of one little patch towards the middle of the block and more or less in the middle of the quilt. It's not going to make the whole quilt feel stiff. So I'm going to finish filling in, going all the way around that circle with this micro stippling, and here's what it looks like whenever I finished my flower design. At this point, I quilted through all 3 flowers, filling them in with that dense micro stippling and quilting the rings, and now it's time to stitch the stem shapes. So I've marked this design, and it's just a simple curving line down to that stem area, and there are a lot of seam allowances, so just get a good grip of your block, carefully stitch that line. So we're going to come up with a curving line, then all the way back down to the starting point, then branch out to both sides. And you saw that little wobble there? That was seam allowance, kind of pressing against the bottom of my foot and forcing it into another direction. It's not the end of the world, but you know what? We can make it look right by going in with an echo, and that just kind of adds a little bit more texture to the leaf shape, and it also makes it look like all those little extra wobbles were intentional, when really they probably weren't. So now I'm going to end up doing the exact same thing to all of the leaves. Whenever I decide to add an element like that, extra travel stitching, extra echoing, then I'm going to do it to all the leaves so that way it's consistent throughout the block. I'm also encountering a few inconsistent stitches here. Some stitches are getting a little bit bigger and then a little bit smaller. It's not the end of the world. I am not going to stop and rip that out just to make it perfect. Let's leave it in and enjoy seeing that it is made by a human being and not by a machine. You know, it's our hands guiding this, and that's how the design is created. So now in the background, we're going to move on to stippling, and this is a much more open version of stippling, although mine is probably being stitched here a little denser than what you got in the pattern. I like stippling that's just slightly bigger than 1/4 inch apart. I just think it looks really nice. I've designed the pattern to be a little bit bigger, maybe a 1/2 inch apart, with the lines apart. Either way, it's going to look great. I just like there to be slightly more texture, and this is a slightly dense area, so in order to get that texture, you have to bring those lines just a little bit closer together. So you can see I just came up and wiggled throughout this area. Now I've hit up against a leaf shape, and this is the cool thing. You can always travel stitch along those ditches. And I've already stitched those lines in the ditch, so I can just travel stitch right along it and then branch out when it's right to keep the design consistent with the rest of the stippling in the background. So now I'm going to wiggle up in between these two flowers. And if you want it to look like the stippling is kind of flowing behind the flowers, then kind of run up against the ditch and then kind of stitch a little bit more of it, run up against the ditch, kind of form it back and forth like that, and it'll look a little bit less like you're just kind of wiggling slightly up a channel. If that doesn't make any sense to you, please just mark your block with the pattern included, and that's a-okay. It's not the end of the world. I am a little bit nitpicky, and I sometimes like to stitch it up a notch and add a little extra texture, and I sometimes spend a lot of time thinking about how that texture looks on my quilt, so that might be just a little bit extreme. So here I'm stitching around that outer flower shape, just taking my stippling and using it to help me move through the block. So my focus here is to fill in this space completely. I don't want to leave a gap. Let's say if I had stitched differently and kind of turned that corner and left a gap. I don't want to do that because I'd have to come back and fill it in later. I want to fill this area completely as I move down. So that's what I'm focusing on. I stitch left to right and right to left, just trying to keep that shape, you know, moving and flowing, and also not repeating itself too many times. Sometimes I'll get into a habit of stitching kind of the same L shape over and over again, and I have to remind myself, nope, it needs to be inconsistent. It needs to be a different flowing shape in order for it to look like a totally random meandering line. That's always the goal with stippling, is to make it look very random and fluid and freeform. So now something I want to hit and take care of while I'm in this location is I want to go on ahead and knock out this stem. And I can use stippling to get me there. So I'm just going to take that line and wiggle right down to that ditch, stitch over a bit, and then now I've connected with that stem line. Go all the way up, hit that point, come all the way back down. Now I am completely ignoring what I marked here on the block. That's okay. Whenever you want to change it up, change it up. There is no rule that says that you have to stitch on the line you marked, because that line's going to erase. You can make it up and change it however you want. I'm adding that little bit of echo quilting here, just that little extra detail, because I did it on the center flower. Now, I could have just done it on the center flower and left it there and done the two side flowers without it. You know, that's a way of making it symmetrical and consistent. You know, to say, hey, the center flower is extra special and it gets an extra special bit of texture. It's totally up to you. I love little additions like that. I think that they really make it special. So now I'm going to travel stitch all the way out until I feel like I'm at a point where it's going to be consistent with the rest of the stippling, connect, and form a design that kind of interlocks with the line before it. So let me spin that around so you can see. It is, of course, white thread on cream fabric, so it's kind of difficult to see. But basically, I took that line and interconnected it with the line before, so it looks almost like that stippling did not stop, it kept going. And that's always the goal. Consistent fluid texture throughout the space. So now I have this nice big area. What I'm going to do is fill it in rows. I'm going to fill all the way down to the corner. And sometimes I'll expand my scale ever so slightly when I'm in an open area. That's okay. Don't want to go too crazy though. I want to keep the lines roughly a consistent distance apart throughout. So now I'm working my way back up, kind of from right to left. But that was more or less in a row, so that way I don't leave pockets or open spaces in the design. And I'm slowly filling gradually towards this point, so that way I can connect with and start quilting my feather design in the base. Here we go, I'm just wiggling back and forth if I need to. I'll stitch in the ditch, travel stitch down, form one last little curly shape, and there we go. Now we are connected with our feathers, and it's time to fill in the base. So this is going to be fun. Basically, I like to rotate the quilt so that way I can clearly see the feather, and it's in the little hoop that I make in my hands, this little ring where I press down on the quilt and it's nicely spaced. Press outwards with my fingertips and down with my thumbs. And now I can stitch right on that marked line, more or less. Kind of stitched off it a little bit, that's okay. So I'm going to stitch up that line to the point of the feather, and then I'm going to travel stitch all the way back. And this is just the way that I like to form feathers. You don't have to do it this way, but I think it adds a little extra drama to that stem. It makes it stand out nicely. Alright, so I'm back at my starting point. Now I'm going to travel stitch along the stem and branch out with the feathers. Doing travel back feathers. So I form the feather shape, hit up against the stem, slow down as I travel stitch back along the feather, and branch out with the next feather. Travel back. We're traveling along the back of the feather shape. I'm just going to stitch slowly and then branch out with that feather shape. So there we go. That's how I'm going to continue forming that feather. Just travel stitch back, branch out, form the feather shape, hit up against that stem, travel stitch back, and form the next feather shape. And if you wanted this to stand out even better, you could just travel stitch right along the outline of the feather, each one, and that's going to make it stand out really nicely too. So I form that last tip of the feather shape. I'm going to travel stitch all the way back to the beginning. So now I'm at the bottom of the feather, and I'm going to stitch this side the exact same way, just forming the bottom feather shape. It kind of sets the stage for the next one because you travel stitch along the back. For me, I find this really easy because I'm using the back of the feather. I reach a certain point and then swirl out and around for the next feather shape. I do find that it works really easily to form it in this direction so that I'm stitching down and then around. So there's a lot of things you can think about with feather, not just forming the shape, but also the direction you're stitching. You can also rotate your block back like this. This is harder, at least for me, because I can't see the line for a little bit. So I'm travel stitching kind of blind, but as you can see, that works too. I think the key is slowing down. As you do that travel stitching, you really have to maintain a slow, steady speed. Stitching carefully, and then branch out and around. Kind of put your foot down because, of course, you're probably naturally going to speed up your hands as you stitch out and around, just following that line. There are other ways of forming feather shapes, so definitely check out our other videos and see how I form feathers in other blocks. You know, there's bounce feathers, there's all kinds of different ways that you can stitch this design, not just one, and there's all different directions and angles you can stitch it in too. If it doesn't feel natural to you, rotate the block, get into a better position, make sure you're comfortable, and I promise the design's going to work out so much better for it. From here, I'm going to travel stitch down this stem one more time, then along the bottom of the block and form the second feather shape, filling in that base completely. Then I'm going to fill in the stippling along this side, connect with that stem, stitch the lines in there, finish off the stippling throughout the background. And here's what it looked like when I finished quilting the center of the block. The last step of the block is to quilt our echo shell border, or little rainbows. This little arching design. Start with the outer arch shape and then stitch inside. This is an internal echo, and just try and make that all in one pass. Nice smooth pass with your hands. And that's going to form those shapes really consistently. Of course, even I struggle with this because it is, you know, it's one of those things that kind of, if you wobble, it's pretty noticeable. So even I sometimes struggle with that a little bit. It's not the end of the world, and it's still going to look great even if it's not perfect. You can also form it the opposite way, starting with the smallest circle first. That might be easier. It might feel different to you. Travel stitch out and then echo it. And then travel stitch and echo again. I always try and look at the design and figure out how I can bounce back and forth so that way I'm generally moving in the right direction. In this case, I kind of ended up opposite of what I wanted. I wanted to hit that circle. But now I'm going to be 2 inches away from it. That's okay. Just travel stitch down that ditch. A little bit of extra stitching in the ditch will not hurt anybody. That's a-okay. And so now I can form that circle shape. So I'm going to stitch this outer circle first, all the way around. Again, try and do that all in one smooth pass. That's going to ensure that it has a little bit less likelihood of wobbles if it's kind of a smooth motion with your hands. Now I'm going to go inside and stitch the spiral, and this is a closed spiral, so I'm going to stitch all the way to the inside and then travel stitch slowly all the way back out again. So slow and careful travel stitching, and if you accidentally stitch off the line, don't worry, just go back over it. I'll throw a little bit more thread at it. That's always my advice. Don't rip it, don't pick it out, just throw a little bit more thread at it, make it pretty, and then you'll be done. And here's what it looks like whenever I finish quilting block number 9. So that's it for this video. I really hope that you enjoyed learning how to quilt this block with me. If you'd like to find the quilt pattern, which includes not only your piecing instructions, but also the quilting diagram so you can mark it on your block, you can find that at leahday.com/blockparty. If you have any questions about this quilting process, please ask in the comments below. I really want to help you learn more about piecing and machine quilting this year. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel on YouTube so you don't miss the next video coming out soon. Until next time, let's go quilt!